Chapter 12, Part 1 of 6 Women and the Invasion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. 6 Women and the Invasion by Gabrielle YERTA and Marguerite YERTA. Chapter 12, Part 1. After 8 months' hopeless waiting, after long weeks spent in a flutter of expectation, we had seen the gate of delivery closed upon us. The others were gone, they were free, and Genevieve and I alone still bore the yoke of invasion, which no one loathed as much as we did. No one had more eagerly wished for freedom, longed to return home, and yearned to meet again those we loved, and alone we stayed behind. The poor girl thought that she would die of despair rather than of illness, and while she moistened her pillow with tears, I hid my sobs in the attic. Madame Charvet took care of Genevieve and did her best to comfort us both. We did not follow the prescriptions of the German doctor, and never once applied cold compresses. A French matron's experience is at times worth more than the learning of a Teutonic physician. We applied mustard poultices and cupping glasses. We gave the patient hot tisane and syrups, which were all the better because they were made in the village. On the 4th of June, 3 weeks after the convoy's departure, we arrived at Morney Station in the care of a sergeant. My sister-in-law was still a convalescent, and we trudged along to the bureau, where our guardian handed over his prisoners. Thus we were restored to liberty. We were no longer emigrants, and with beating hearts we went back home. On seeing us, my mother-in-law Yvonne and Colette well nigh turned into stone. They thought we had been in Paris for 2 months at least. We returned to our old habits. 5 women were again under the same roof, 5 women in the midst of invasion. One only had succeeded in escaping. No change for the better in the village. A single detail amused us. The soldiers of the line lived as before in a white house at the corner of the street. For a long time one of its stout occupants, perched on a ladder, taking great pains and putting out his tongue, had formulated this wish in big black letters: God punish England. And now, on account of recent events, the painter had added in a fit of rage, and the devil run away with Italy. The hussars of the farm were gone, Bouillot at their head, and that day the village had heaved a deep sigh. As a last theft, the Pandours had carried away a cart full of furniture, in order to make themselves comfortable in the trenches which would shelter them. On the other hand, 2 convoys were still quartered within our gates, and troops of passage were now and then billeted upon us. We gave hospitality to a young lieutenant who had succeeded Boubenpeck as commandant. He lodged in the 2 rooms we had abandoned to the Prussians with a heavy heart. He had requisitioned, besides, the small room for his servant and the stable for his horse. Gracieux and Percinet, shut up in a corner of the coach-house, would gladly have seen the Prussian mare dead, which had usurped their domain. We, too, bore a grudge against the fat Hans, who encumbered our rooms with his person, his pipes, and his clothes. So, resigned to fate, we established ourselves in the drawing-room, Genevieve and I. One of the windows looks into the street, and when, behind the lace of our curtains, we saw, hour after hour, day after day, the same carts loaded with straw, the same placid-looking Prussians (they are all alike), the same stiff and sneering lieutenants, we might have believed our stay in Jouville had been but a dream. The invaders seemed more at home than ever. The officers enjoyed themselves according to rule. Of course they had not waited for the spring to lead a jolly life. As early as November, 1914, they had had drunken revelries. What merry evenings! What dishes never tasted in Germany! What floods of good wine! What erotic, patriotic, and Bacchic songs! Let us drink and eat, for we shall die tomorrow. But no, we shall not die. We, who shout the loudest, we are safe. We do not go to the front, we stay behind, secure from danger. No other task but to grind down, vex, and punish civilians. Let us profit by the war. Joy's the word. There was a festival yesterday at Léon. It will be at Morny today. Tomorrow it will be Coucy's turn. Still more revels, still more junketings. It is war! Hurrah for the war! And all enjoyed themselves, those who cared for nothing as well as those who cared first to save their skin, Sybarites as well as sentimentalists, the pompous as well as the dissipated. But this demands an explanation. We had seen many officers of the reserve, the very men whom the Gazette des Ardennes calls the flower of cultured German manhood. But we had discovered few varieties among them, and all of them could be comprised in one of the categories we had created for the purpose. Those who cared for nothing deserve careful consideration. They partook of the qualities common to their brothers in arms, which I will extol farther on. But their pusillanimity or their indifference belonged alone to them. Such, for instance, was this lieutenant quartered in Léon, who confided to everyone willing to listen to him, "I don't care a fig for the fate of Germany. If only the war would end soon, and I could get on with my studies and make myself a good position after, I should be content." Of the same kind was the young commandant of the village, lamed by a fall from his horse. "The war," he said, "what do I care for it? I am unfit for fighting, do you see? I shall neither be killed nor mutilated, and it is all one to me how long the war will last. I have comfortable rooms and get good dinners without untying my purse strings. I am well paid and able to save. When we are at peace again, I shall have a jaunt, and then go back to Germany. Men will be rare, and I shall marry whom I choose, the richest girl I can hear of course. My future is assured, and so I am quite easy in my mind." We thought still more disgusting those who first cared for their skin. We were pleased to observe not a few cowards who strove with feet, hand, and purse to avoid danger and keep behind the line. Love of life, self-esteem, a dislike for bloodshed, and a natural dread of blows kept them from the front. They thought of but one goal, to cling at any price to safety. I wrote "at any price" on purpose. Several of them boasted they had paid for not being sent to the front. Where, when, how, to whom, I do not know. By what mysterious bribery, by what surreptitious palm greasing other people will perhaps establish. The truth of such things is not easy to ascertain. I can only state that 2 officers and a sergeant belonging to different regiments told those in whose houses they lodged, one in Léon, the other in Morny and Jouvy, that they had paid from 4,000 francs to 6,000 francs to get leave to keep out of danger's way. Thus they obtained a few months' respite, after which they had to pay again or endanger their lives. When we were at Jouvy, a stout sergeant, nicknamed Tripe, well nigh died of an apoplectic stroke on hearing he was ordered to go to the front. "I have paid 4,000 francs to be exempted from fighting. I thought the war wouldn't last so long, and now I have no money left." Mad with rage, he dashed his helmet right across the room, and this martial attribute was picked up with its point all awry. As to private soldiers, who told their host they had acted in the same way, I will not even try to count them. They are too many. The other officers owned a certain number of qualities in common. According to the individuals, one of these characteristics eclipsed the others, and the dominant feature helped us to classify the fools. Of the sentimentalists, Herr Mayer was the best specimen. His eyes cast upon the blue sky, he murmured his regrets in a voice broken by tears. His wife, so many griefs, and so many dead. How dreadful is war! If only we could make a holy alliance of the peoples! I must say that Herr Mayer kept his sensibility in his pocket and took it out only at dessert. In the discharge of his duties he forgot this faculty completely. The pompous officers were more entertaining. Such was a certain cavalry officer who, at the end of September, put up for a few days at M. Launay's. His name ended in "ski." He twirled his mustachio after the Polish fashion, and drew himself up most elegantly. Once upon a time he happened to go through the drawing room, where Genevieve was talking with Madame Launay. The surprise sent a thrill through him. "Why, two pretty women! Quick, let us show off!" And the braggart began to hold forth in praise of Germany. "Ah, mesdames, the Emperor is extremely satisfied with the march of our army. Our gallant soldiers laugh at obstacles and advance as if by miracle." This speech was made shortly after the Battle of the Marne. Unfortunately, the hearers, as well as the orator, were unacquainted with the event, which, had they known of it, would have given yet more meaning to the gentleman's discourse. The same Rittmeister could not refrain from delivering high-sounding addresses to all whom he met. In case of need, he even fell back on the man who split the wood or the maid of all work. "Have you seen," he would say, "have you seen our splendid Imperial Guard? Have you noticed the gait of our soldiers? Do you know that no troops in the world are to be compared with them?" And for a revictualling cart that rattled by, for a soldier's shirt drying on a hedge, he would pour forth his soul in dithyrambs on Germany's greatness, invincibility, and might. You will think, no doubt, that the first and foremost soldier of the Prussian army, the supreme chief of our enemy, would take his place, not without the radiance of a star, among his confrères of pomposity. Another pompous talker, a sub-lieutenant and former law student, lodged in the spring of 1915 at Madame Lantois'. He set up for a linguist, and wanted us to believe he knew French better than we. Once I brought him a demand note to sign. He carped at a word I used. I tried to defend my prose, but he stopped me with a motion of his hand. "I know the word and how to use it." I had nothing to do but hold my tongue, so I did, like one thunderstruck. Unfortunately, the eloquent rascal took it into his head to turn his stay in France to account. Are we to suppose he thought he would thus acquire a few niceties of speech of which he was ignorant? Nobody knows. But he was often to be seen seated in the big kitchen, devoutly listening to the conversation of the workers, to the stories of the old people of the farm, to whom Madame Lantois spoke sharply when they lingered too long. The lieutenant knew how to listen, how to learn, how to remember what he heard. For one day we heard him say, thumping his fist on the table, "Je savais ce que je disais." Among our guests were a great many Sybarites. Is Barbou's love of creature comforts still remembered? And the many cushions necessary to uphold his person? Can you imagine that some of them, before choosing their room, felt the elasticity of the mattresses, tried the softness of the blankets, inspected the fineness of the sheets? Are the nice afternoon naps already forgotten? We are at war, but that is no reason to give up comfort. Let us have carpets and cushions, wadding and down. We are Sybarites. The category to which we come now, the brutes, is the most scandalously celebrated. The present war has been its triumph. I must say, we never saw these gentlemen at their best, such as they showed themselves in assaults, in pillage, in massacre, in arson. We did see them as brutes in their treatment of a peaceful, submissive, terrified population, brutes who thought they had drawn in their claws. Vuillot, for instance, was a beautiful specimen of the kind, but we saw many another. For instance, there was the hero who had a small boy of Jouvy bound fast to a post during an icy cold afternoon. There was that other who knocked down the shepherd boy of Aulnoy and gave him a good horsewhipping. The poor boy had gone beyond the frontier of the commune with his cattle. "What am I to do?" he said. "My master's meadow is in Vevey's. I must feed my flock, and at the office they won't give me a pass. They say I don't want one to go those few steps. I should never finish telling the high deeds of those scoundrels, and I have still to sing the praises of the revelers. They were many in number, and I think more dangerous than the rest. They came to France, allured by the depravity they attributed to us, and it was they who brought to us their vices, particularly those exclusive to their race, on which I had rather not insist. No doubt they thought that they would do a pious work in helping to pervert a country which they hated. Be that as it may, they eagerly exerted themselves to this end, and did their best to transform the country behind the front into a vast brothel. Of course such creatures had not the least respect for the house which sheltered them. An old lady in mourning was deeply shocked at being forced to provide two fast girls of Laon with lodging and board for some days, and many a country house, which had never looked upon other than peaceful scenes, was scared at revels, the noise of which made the very window panes tremble. Bubenpec was a remarkably vicious specimen. A bottle of champagne was never emptied in the province without his presence. He was at every feast, he took part in every rejoicing. He rarely came home before 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. He had a pretty taste in wine and nice dinners. Besides, he looked upon himself as Don Juan, and expected everyone to yield to him. No thought hindered his caprices. One day he asked a young girl publicly to come and see him in his rooms. Another day we saw him towards dusk kiss 2 loose girls in the open street. To be at perfect liberty, he sent to prison, under some pretense or another, a man whose daughter he was paying court to. He inscribed among the women inspected by the police the name of a young girl who, though not very respectable, had done no harm but reject his advances. With real Gallic humor, our good villagers were careful to catalogue the great deeds of our guests, chiefly when heroines from the other side of the Rhine came upon the scene. One Sunday morning about 10 o'clock there appeared at our house a little German nurse of the Red Cross, dark-haired, smart, and, a fact hardly to be believed, pretty. But the lady had a peevish air, an air only. "Lieutenant Bubenpec?" "Out." With all possible speed the orderly went to fetch the officer. Bubenpec came back as fast as he could, shut himself up with the little dame, and did not move until 4 o'clock in the afternoon, forgetful of his lunch. And the orderly, who timidly presented himself for duty, was roughly sent away from the closed door. "Oh!" said Madame Verlaine, shocked. "Such impudence! In my house!" The neighbors made jokes and watched the door. They even laid wagers. They will come out, they won't. At last the couple came out, and disappeared on foot towards Laon. A moment after a murmur was heard. "What does it mean?" To show his disregard of decency, Bubenpec had thrown his window wide open before going out. And now the whole village gathered about our windows and jeered at the shameless disorder of the room and bed. So while some officers clearly belonged to such and such a category, they all possessed to a certain degree the qualities peculiar to the other classes. But there were real mongrels among them. For instance, you can imagine for yourself a sentimental fine talker and a sybarite who cared for his skin, or a brutish reveler. And there was a sameness in all, a family resemblance. Prussian militarism, hypocrisy, and haughtiness were smeared over them all, like a thick coat of paint. All showed an extreme satisfaction with their own race and person. In short, you have but to scratch the Prussian to find the barbarian. Should an opportunity offer, or even no opportunity, they can all be unreasonable, harsh, unrelenting. These gentlemen enjoyed themselves. In a physical sense, you can easily picture to yourself those revelers. They were not handsome. At least we never came across one we thought handsome, in spite of our efforts to be impartial. Save Bouillot, we never saw a very tall one. They were either long and thread-like, or short and fat. Those who thought they had a look of Apollo you might reproach with thick wrists and ankles, large hips, and heavy feet. Most of them had shapely hands, and very often well-kept nails. Their features were unpleasing from being shockingly irregular or freezingly regular. Their hard eyes belied the false kindness of their smile. At a distance, their stiff and starched gait, their mechanical movement; at close quarters, their voice, their smell, their whole being made us bristle with hostility. For a trifle we would have snarled at them like a dog, and every day their presence lay heavier on our hearts. Their smell! Some people deny its reality. Let them go to the north of France. When you have lodged Prussian officers, very clean people no doubt, you may air the room 8 days running, and it will not lose the smell sui generis which impregnates it, and every inhabitant of the village, from the mayor down to the smallest child, would turn up his nose on entering the room and say, "Faugh! It smells of Prussians here!" Such as they were, the gentlemen amused themselves. Some maintained even that they made conquests. I am touching here on a very delicate subject, the relations between the invaders and the women of the invaded countries. There has been much talk of rape. Compared with the crimes committed in Belgium and in Lorraine, the misdeeds we shall mention are but little things. To be sure, there were rapes, but thanks be to God, they were few, and they took place at the beginning of the invasion, chiefly after the Germans' retreat on the Marne. In Jouvy I heard many a sad story. There was the story of a young woman of Chevreny who went mad after her misfortune, and of several old women too. For hardly credible as it seems, old women often fall victims to acts of violence, because they lacked agility to run away. At Bray, several soldiers fell upon a woman of 80, knocked her down, and beat her most unmercifully. At Chamois, in October 1914, a few women were living in a cellar, frightened to death. One evening, one of them told me, we heard a loud cry. There was a falling of stones, and a young woman tumbled down into the cellar through a shell hole. Thus she escaped from her pursuers, but her companion, an old woman of 68, fell defenseless into the hands of the filthy fellows. Ah, we had many proofs of the respect the Germans have for old age. A woman of Cerney, 87 years old, small and white-haired, with red eyes and a shaking head, told us how she had left her lodging. I had a small bundle of clothes ready lying on the table, but the soldiers did not allow me to go in and take it. They beat me. As I didn't go, I had money too in my bundle. They forced me to go. They all flocked around me. They were 12, and how am I to say it? In short, the 12 rascals had driven the poor old woman out of her house by directing towards her that which a famous statue innocently eternalizes in Brussels. Stripped of her spare clothes and money, filthy, disgusted at what she had seen, the unhappy woman had to go to a neighbor to beg for a bodice and a petticoat, that she might cast away her soiled clothes. When the Germans settled themselves upon us, these feats of the satyr were no longer common. Here and there evil deeds were still spoken of, and a doctor of the neighborhood told us in the spring of 1915 that nearly every week there was an act of violence. I must confess that many a woman was the victim of her own imprudence. When you have lived all your life in a quiet village, among kind people, you have some difficulty in believing that you must be on your guard for months together, that you are forever surrounded with brutes. So, more than one villager had reason to regret having gone alone to the forest, or having persisted in living in a lonely house. But the systematic brutalities, the collective assaults, which marked the beginning, were no longer known. The method had changed. There were acts of violence which were no less terrible for being moral. In many a village whose inhabitants suffered hunger, the children were provided with bread and soup. Yes, but this privilege was reserved for the children whose mothers showed themselves complacent towards the soldiers. And these women accepted dishonor because they could not bear to see their little ones pine away and die, while others could not withstand the troubles and vexations that lay in store for good women. A cry of reprobation and horror arose when we heard that the conduct of all women was not blameless. In the first place, there were the women of the lowest class. Even Boule de Suif herself would have been tamed after daily relations with the German soldiers. Of course, a few black sheep are a disgrace to the flock, and I can fancy women haters shrugging their shoulders in scorn when they hear of this. Gently, sir, a truce to jeering. More than one person wearing a beard gave abundant proof of an equal complaisance. Alas, traitors were to be found among us. For instance, there were those who welcomed the Germans with a smile, and revealed to them the resources of the place. There were those, the foulest of all, who denounced French soldiers hidden in the woods or those who fed the fugitives. There were those who, for a little money or food, pointed out the hiding places of his neighbors, and thus surrendered to the enemy wine, grain, potatoes, even money and jewels. But I am pleased to say that such despicable wretches were rare, and on the whole the population was proud and dignified, and opposed to the invaders' dishonesty a solid brotherhood, which no troubles, no persecutions could lessen or fatigue. And yet we led a grievous life. The Germans seemed to aim at making it as hard as possible, while theirs was as merry as can be. The winter had been painful, but the summer was still more so. We had less liberty and less food. We were allowed to leave the place we lived in but 3 times a week, and on stated days. Besides, we had to ask for a pass 2 days beforehand, and pay 75 centimes for it when it was granted, which was not always the case. It was almost impossible to go to the country from Laon, and for weeks together nobody was allowed to leave the town. One day passports had been freely given to the people, tradesmen mostly, who went to Marle to buy raw sugar, a yellowish sticky substance with a taste of glue, and a little butter, precious goods that were still to be found there in small quantities. They all came back furious. At different points of the road, level crossings, outskirts of villages, they had all been arrested. Men and women had been then entirely stripped of their garments and searched according to rule. Nurses of the Red Cross and soldiers showed equal zeal in the task, which had a practical object, the gathering of all gold and even silver coins of 5 francs, which pockets and purses might contain. The sum seized, it must be said, was replaced by notes of the Reichsbank. The victims thought the joke a very bad one, and I am sure Thomas of Marle's bones must have turned in his grave. To think that on this nobleman's own territory soldiers arrested and robbed the passers-by, and he was not there to help. And what is worse, the aggressors were German troopers, and the victims good and loyal French citizens. What does your shade regret, O famous plunderer? To be unable to fight for your countrymen, or to have no share in the robbery? I need not say that after that no gold pieces ever ventured out on the roads. A pass also was necessary to go out into the country, and you were expected to have an identity card in your pocket if you but stood on your threshold. All papers had to be renewed every fortnight. "Fancy," an aged woman said to us, "that I have to pay 20 marks because I forgot my antiquity card." One Saturday a farmer's wife, perched on a ladder out of doors, was eagerly polishing the glass of a bull's-eye window. 2 gendarmes on horseback passed by and gave heed to this commendable zeal. "Madame, carte." Hem. Ah, yes, my identity card. Wait a minute. It is lying on the table." "Ha! No, not enter. No card. Fine." So she had to pay the fine. One of our neighbors was taking his cows out of the stable. Suddenly one of them seemed to smell some enlivening odor. Was it that of powder? She bent a frolicsome head on one side, lifted up her sprightly nostrils, raised a swaggering tail, and as fast as she could tear, went full gallop towards the meadows, the brooklet, the rosy horizon where the setting sun pleased her. The owner took to his heels in his turn, and fled after the giddy pated creature. The better to run, he tore off his jacket, and succeeded in getting hold of the tether. Then he stopped panting, all in a sweat, and rapped out a tremendous oath. As if by miracle, a gendarme happened to stand there, his notebook in hand. "Card, card." "Oh, it is in my jacket pocket." The jacket was smiling in the distance, a small spot lying on the green. "Ach," the Prussian said with a sneer, "not fetch, fine." "Cost?" 50 francs. Rascally cow! I treat the matter as a joke. Sometimes we did joke. We could not have our minds always on the stretch. We already were half crazy, and we should have gone quite mad if we had not occasionally laughed. We often laughed with rage, with an empty stomach, with our brain confused after a troubled night. Our race needs to laugh in the midst of tears, and tears are shed in secret, whereas laughter bursts forth in public. End of chapter 12, part 1. Chapter 12, part 2 of The 6 Women and the Invasion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. 6 Women and the Invasion by Gabrielle YERTA and Marguerite YERTA. Chapter 12, Part 2. When the Germans laugh, it is always a peal. As to tears, they trickle down their cheeks for a trifle. They bathe in them. They pour them forth everywhere. I had always looked upon this lachrymal faculty so often spoken of as a legend, but we have come to the conclusion that there is nothing more real. An untoward event, a deception, bad news, or simply homesickness and melancholy, anything is an excuse for tears. Here is a famous example. Those who have visited the battlefields of Marla-Tours and Gravelotte have seen the famous monument, a granite armchair in the midst of a lawn, surrounded with a balustrade. This noble simplicity should speak to the soul of itself. Yet an inscription explains: during the battle of Marla-Tours, the Emperor Wilhelm I sat here and wept. Of course, he thought the game was lost, but if his descendants are faithful to tradition, where will they get the torrents of tears they will have to shed within a short time? However, we are not always crying. We even try to enjoy the summer, to make up for the sad spring we had spent. As we had to plead a practical object, to obtain leave to take walks out of the village, we begged to be allowed to go and fetch wood. And lying on the grass in the open country, we tried to forget the war for a few moments, Genevieve and I, lost in the surrounding calm and beauty. But distant rumors soon belied our short-lived illusions, and dispelled the poor creations of the fancy. No, it was not peace. Our stomachs, always clamoring for food, never failed to tell us so. During the month of June we hardly ate anything except asparagus and cherries. These things are not highly nutritious. No potatoes, a slice of horrid, sticky, sour German bread. Then came carrots, green peas, and artichokes, and we no longer starved. And when in the second fortnight of August there arrived the food sent by the Spanish-American Board of Relief, we thought we had been transported to a land of cocaine. 20 grams of bacon daily, a dish of rice on Sunday, a dish of beans on Thursday. Eatable bread! What would you ask for? No matter. I wonder, when we are once out of this vale of hunger, how long it will be before we recover our former health. During the month of July we spent the hot hours of the day out of doors, stretched on the grass. Being near a field of corn, we put out a timid hand. and from time to time broke off ripe ears. We rubbed them between our fingers, and their plump grains, stripped of the husks, seemed to us delicious food. It was strictly forbidden to pluck corn, however small the quantity might be. Our leather bags may be searched, we thought, but they cannot make a post mortem examination of us to make sure of a possible theft. For there is no doubt that we were committing highway robbery to the prejudice of the Germans. When we had yawned the whole long day away, in wearisomeness and hunger, we might have hoped to slumber at night, for sleep is as good as a dinner. Alas, remember the Germans' revels! These gentry were no longer allowed to find their amusement out of the village in which they were quartered. Every night the officers of Morny will disport themselves in Morny. Yes, indeed. They spent their evenings in a house which they had transformed into a casino, amid laughter and songs. Only the immediate neighbors were kept awake. But about 12 or 1 o'clock we never failed to start up in our beds as the songs and cries came nearer. Here are the brutes going home. What whim will they take into their heads tonight? We heard them approach to the strains of accordions and mouth organs. From upstairs we saw them dressed up like women, with plumed hats on, stopping at every door, trying, it would seem, who could bawl the loudest. Or they tricked themselves out as house painters, carried buckets and brooms, and set high ladders against the walls, and climbed up as if to storm the house. Another time they would pretend to be strolling musicians, and, armed with saucepans and cauldrons, would give a mock serenade that would have put the dead to flight. Or, what was far worse, the noise of their steps would be scarcely audible. They would talk in whispers and stifle their laughter. And lying in the dark, we said to ourselves, still half asleep, "They seem quiet tonight. Perhaps we shall be able to go to sleep again." But, all of a sudden, bing bang, formidable blows with revolvers shook the wooden shutters and resounded in the room like peals of thunder. The unexpected noise startled us out of our torpor, and we could hardly recover our breath. The next day Madame Lantois, half sour, half sweet, asked her lieutenant, "Well, you had some fun last night?" "Oh, yes. We knocked hard at the windows of all houses where there are young girls." Maybe the officer read disapproval in the features of his interlocutor, for he went on, "We are merry. You may be sure that the French officers amuse themselves in the same way." "In the same way? Oh, no, Mr. ex-law student of Heidelberg." One evening an officer whose rooms were not far from our house refused to take part in a drunken orgy. He was tired, he had a headache. In short, he preferred to go to bed. There were guests in Morny, and before they left to drive home, the whole band made an irruption into the refractory officer's room, tore him from his bed, and with shouts of laughter hoisted him into the visitor's carriage and ordered the coachman to drive on. At the end of the village our man was stripped of his nightshirt, deposited on the road, and his comrades went away at full speed. As naked as when he was born, he had to walk along the high street to get back to his quarters. The commandant of the village, to whom we gave hospitality, did not care to put a stop to these extravagances. Being but 25, he had little authority over his comrades, and, besides, from time to time he liked an orgy himself. He was famous for his worship of Bacchus. He was as long as a day without bread. He had a small boy's head, adorned with large outstretched ears at the top of it. The women of the village, at the sight of his slender calves, had surnamed him Jackdaw's Leg. More stupid than bad, he felt frightfully dull at Morny, and talked with raptures of his stay in Belgium. "What a good time I had of it," he used to say. "I was drunk from morning till night." That he might not get quite out of practice, Jackdaw's Leg tippled as often as he could, and many a night his unsteady legs were at much pains to convey him home without accident. We knew him by his uncertain gait. and when drunk he never failed to prevent us from sleeping the livelong night. He sought laboriously for the dancing keyhole. Then he banged to the door. At length he succeeded in getting to his room, and his door was hardly shut when the result of his excess burst forth noisily, and sinister detail we perceived a characteristic clash of wash-hand basin and slop pail. Then desperate hiccups, groanings, and sighs were audible, and the whole house resounded with his laborious efforts. Upstairs we heard Colette, furious and disgusted, rail against the tipsy fellow. "You dirty, loathsome brute! Pig!" Then nothing was heard but snores. The officer had certainly flung himself upon his bed with his boots on. And the following morning plump Hans, his servant, was to be seen all aflutter, running to and fro with water, pails, and floor cloths. Sometimes the painful scene took place in the street. The disreputable traces of it were still to be seen on wall and pathway the next morning, and the lieutenant made for his rooms with deep sighs. Yet he was able to walk by himself to our house. What could we say of that captain who, in Juville, used to be wheeled home in a barrow by his servants? At that time an adventure happened by night which I cannot recall without an inward thrill of fear. It was already late in the evening, and we were shut up in our room, Genevieve and I. Our windows were open, and the strong wooden shutters were carefully closed. We had been talking for some time, lying in the dark, and were about to fall asleep, when we heard a carriage rattle by, and then stop at the farther end of the house. It was about 11:30. "Kolb! Kolb!" cried a loud voice. Such was the official name of Jackdaw's leg. A silence followed, then the owner of the voice seemed to grow impatient. "Kolb! Kolb! Kolb!" No answer came. The uproarious fellow bellowed, "Kolb! Kolb!" I bounced out of bed, still drowsy. "This man will wake up the whole street," I murmured. "I believe we had better answer." "Lieutenant Kolb is at the casino," I cried from behind the shutter. "What?" asked the voice. I thought my interlocutor 15 yards from thence, in front of the gate. My hand, leaning against the fastening, unconsciously turned it. All of a sudden it was wrenched from my grasp, and the shutters flew wide open. As quick as lightning I shut the window, stuck to the wall, and slipped behind the piano. Genevieve had started to her feet and stretched herself at full length along the bed. We saw the man produce an electric lamp from his pocket, and with his nose flattened against the window pane, try to catch a glimpse of the inside of the room. The curtains prevented him from seeing clearly anything, but we got a full view of his person. He was a captain, colossus-like, thick-featured, and red-bearded. He had a helmet and a gray coat on. He sat on the window-sill and muttered in a clammy, drunken voice, "Mademoiselle, mademoiselle, open the window. I want to wish you a good morning. Shake hands with me. Mademoiselle, open the window." We held our breaths. We dared not stir a finger. Then the officer got up, stepped backwards, took a survey of the house, and made for the next window. He shook the shutters, which did not give way, and went to try the others. How eagerly we wished the orderly had shut up everything at his master's! The first window held out, the second too, but the fastening of the third one yielded, and we heard the man jump into the room. As if he knew the ins and outs, he swiftly crossed both rooms and the passage, and stopped at our door. "Open!" He gave a knock, then made an endeavor to open the door. We were struck with dismay. With a shove of his shoulders he might have forced the lock. With naked feet and nothing but a nightgown on, how should we have been able to stand up against this booted, armed giant if he had broken in? Noiselessly Genevieve sprang towards me. I softly opened the window overlooking the garden, and we jumped out, careless of the pebbles that bruised our feet, ran along the house with all possible speed, and stopped at my mother-in-law's window. "Mother! Mother! Open the window!" Our voices were low, but so anxious that the shutters immediately flew open. We climbed in like cats and hastily closed the window. With strained ears we listened to the intruder's goings and comings. But he soon jumped out of the window, and after renewed calling and knocking we heard his carriage roll away. We prudently waited some time before venturing out. Then we poked our noses into the passage, and making sure the enemy had really withdrawn, we took once more possession of our own room. But alas! our emotion had destroyed all chances of sleep. Day after day, night after night, alarm upon alarm, the summer glided by. Then came the harvest time. The farmers were much agitated, for the Germans had declared that they would gather in the harvest. They did so. Ah, the birds will long remember the summer of 1915. The harvest lasted 3 months, and all that time the grain strewed the ground. Every overripe sheaf lost in transport half its wealth. "They are but lazy bones, the whole pack of them," Monsieur Lantois muttered between his teeth. "When we gather in the harvest, we get up at 3 o'clock and work till 8 or 9, and we hurry over our meals. But those fellows, they get up at 6, leave off work from 11 to 1, and have done with it at 5. If the soldiers did not tire themselves out, the civilians they employed showed no eager haste to do things properly. The peasants were full of indignation. If those idiots had allowed us to gather in the harvest on the condition that we gave them half or even a third of it, they would have had more corn than they have now, and we should have been provided for the whole year." However, the Prussians at last understood that more speed was necessary, and since all the able-bodied men were requisitioned, it was the turn of the women. The rural constable announced one evening that women who would work in the fields would receive 2 francs a day. This aroused a great deal of wonder. In the times we lived in, 2 francs were looked upon as a large sum, and many women hired themselves out willingly. A week after, there was a sudden fall in the tariff. The women heard they would be paid only 4 pence a day, and the female workers dwindled to 0. The soldiers, in a rage, tried to enlist the women in their very houses, but they did not succeed. One had a bad headache, another was in bed, a third was nursing her baby, a fourth was sitting up by her sick mother, and so on. This state of things did not last long. The military authorities issued an order which enjoined all women from 16 to 50 to be on the place of the village at such an hour, to be enrolled as day laborers. Mothers of young children alone were exempt. We looked at one another in bewilderment. Why, then, we had to go too! But if we can wield the pen and the needle, and on occasion the broom, we are not trained to handle the sickle, the spade, and the rake. Besides, Genevieve was hardly recovered. Colette is as slender as a reed, and if Yvonne and I are far from being viragos in times of peace, we were still weaker after a year of privation and trouble. "The little of health and life we have left would be lost in the fields," said Yvonne. "I won't risk it," said Genevieve. "I had rather go to prison. Let them take me to Chalandry." It was at Chalandry that the Germans had installed a prison for women. Jackdaw's leg good-humoredly reassured us in his most Teutonic accents. "The measures in hand concern but the peasants," he said. It is worth while remarking that the officers did their best to be on tolerable terms with their hosts, and when the inhabitants were ill-treated, the head of the house was sure to be away. Now, Jackdaw's leg had been feeling very poorly for some weeks. Was it due to homesickness and to a longing for sauerkraut and sausages? Or might it not rather come from too many merry parties? In short, the Commandant seemed to languish, and 10 times a day lay down on his couch. As he had 2 bedrooms at his disposal, he slept in one bed by night, and for variety's sake in the other by day, unmindful of the fact that he thus requisitioned 2 pairs of sheets a week, that soap was scarcely to be had, and that the poor washerwoman had to whiten the linen with wood ashes. Jackdaw's leg, being ill, got a month's leave of absence and disappeared in the background. His place was filled up by the young linguist who had put up at Madame Lantois'. He would gladly have seen us dead. Calling on his brothers in arms, lingering without a motive, or for a wrong motive, in our garden, in our lobby, or on our threshold, peeping through the keyholes, we once detected him in this occupation. He had discovered that our souls were not unworthy of associating with his, mad for music and philology, enamored of art and culture. Notwithstanding that we had the reputation of hating the Germans, this nice Prussian, who produced in tippling houses a list of at least 1,003 names, the list of his conquests in France, this nice Prussian then gave us to understand that he would condescend to enter into relations with us, relations based on philosophy, science, and literature. Why not on politics? We responded in such a manner to his advances as to convince even a Prussian. And since then the fellow had borne us a dangerous grudge. 2 days after the departure of Jackdaw's leg, we heard a beat of the rural constable's drum. Women from 16 to 50, 1 o'clock, market-place. We hardly listened to it. It was no concern of ours. But at 1 o'clock Madame Lantois ran up breathless. "Do you know that the lieutenant just said that everybody must go to the market-place? He even told us that if you didn't go, he would send 4 soldiers to fetch you and take you off to Chalandry." Consternation! Alarm! It was 12 o'clock according to German time. Without waiting for luncheon, we ran out in all directions to look for substitutes. At 1 we arrived on the Place, attended by 4 old women, still hale and hearty, and well pleased to fill our places. For of course to the scanty pay of the Germans we had agreed to add the usual price of a day's work. The sight of the place suggested a picture of the slave market. Women wearing light blouses and coarse linen aprons had gathered on both sides. To shield themselves from the glare of the sun, the most of them wore a handkerchief tied under the chin. A few of them, laughing, tossed their sunburnt hair, and many with weary faces leaned against the tools they had brought. There were gloomy-eyed women who up to that time had never done any work but housekeeping. There were young girls, carefully looked after by their mothers, who did not know what to do with themselves. There were sedate, stern-looking workers, and at last the usual set of soldiers' wenches, laughing at and making fun of the others, noisier than the rest of the company, and thinking that they might do what they liked. Under the shade of the plane trees was seated Jacob. Such was the Christian name of the lieutenant, and no one gave him another, busy calling the names over. Ours was among the last. We answered without wincing, and then presented our substitutes. Thus did we baffle the trick which Jacob wanted to play us. This enforced service brought about many troubles between the invaders and the inhabitants. So the Germans had prudently turned the sugar mill of Aulnoy into a prison for male culprits, and converted a house at Chalandry into a jail for women. And if you showed the least disposition to disobedience, you were immediately taken into custody. Did you call a private soldier such names as he had deserved 100 times? To prison with you. Had you kept back any goods from the perquisitioners? To prison with you. Were you unwilling to comply with the requisitioner's orders? To prison with you. Were you penniless when liable to a fine? To prison with you. To prison! To prison! Half a dozen men from Morny were forever ruralizing at Aulnoy. Of course it is no disgrace to be put into prison by the Germans, but it is a well-known fact that the diet of the Prussian jails is anything but engaging. A girl of 16 coming back one evening from the fields threw her pickaxe on her threshold and cried out in tears, "I won't work any longer for those barbarians." An indiscreet ear overheard the sentence, which was repeated in high quarters. Now, the word barbarians is to a German like a red rag to a bull. So 2 days afterwards the family of the imprudent little person were awakened out of their sleep at 4 o'clock in the morning. A sergeant and 4 men came to fetch the guilty girl and take her to Chalendry. Half an hour was granted her to get ready. Mad with despair and shaken with sobs herself, she left her parents sunk in desolation and in tears. They even did not know how long their child would be imprisoned. Towards evening the father succeeded in seeing the commandant, who told him his daughter would be in prison for 3 weeks. I was not too uncomfortable, the poor thing said afterwards. One of the nurses was rather nice. We were sewing the whole day long. But there were such funny women there. I should think so. Then what an excellent pretext for vexatious measures was this enforced service! A rich landowner of Vevey's, who was ill, sent a servant of his, old but able-bodied, to take his place. One morning the officer asked, "Why does Monsieur Villars not come himself?" "He is ill." "He is not so ill as you are pleased to say. He must come, and we will see what occupation he is fit for." Monsieur Villars had to yield, and by way of an easy little job he was ordered to clean the soldiers' closet and gather up dung on the road. Ah, the enslavers knew how to rouse our wrath, and more than one Prussian well nigh paid with his life for his insolence. If our men strove hard to be always submissive, it is because they knew that a single attempt at revolt might have caused the village to be set on fire, and the inhabitants dispersed. Yet once a worker had a quarrel with a Russian. He was a youth of 18, who, when he had seen the convoys go away, had cried for rage and clenched his fists, saying, "Ah, if I were but allowed to go! Within 8 days I should wear red trousers." He did not know that red trousers were blue now, but he meant well, and this young fellow one evening gave a sharp answer to one of the soldiers who supervised the work of the fields. The Prussian, not quick at the answer, aimed his revolver at him. The boy stooped down, and the bullet was lost in a bush. At the same time a sudden collective rage seized upon the companions of the young man, who had listened to the quarrel a few steps away. Armed with hay forks, scythes, and spades, they rushed headlong upon the common enemy, who bounded forward and fled across the country. It was a splendid chase, Jacques Bonhomme pursuing Michael. With the whole band at his heels, the Prussian raced across fields and meadows, cleared the hedges, crossed the brooks, got to the village, and went to earth. The pursuers stopped and looked at one another. What were we going to do? With a sheepish look and their arms dangling, they went home more than ever depressed beneath a feeling of helplessness. Our tyrants were not content with worrying us with passports and enforced service. They continued to strip us methodically, poor shorn lambs as we were, to whom the wind was not tempered, but whose food was strictly measured. Though the Germans had taken all the fruits of the fields, they were still afraid that something might be left us to eat. So the farmers' wives were forced during the summer to reconstitute their poultry yards. All birds were counted and requisitioned. Besides, the farmers had to deliver to the commandateur as many eggs as they had hens every 4th day. What are we to do if the hens lay no eggs? Do as you will, replied the Germans. The fruit trees in the orchards and gardens looked promising. We all rejoiced at it. If we have nothing else to eat, we shall have marmalade. But the first rosy tint had hardly spread over the cheeks of the apples when the rural constable proclaimed throughout the village, "When good and ripe, fallen apples should be brought to the bureau. A severe penalty will be enforced on the refractory persons." But the Germans still thought that we might cheat them, and the fruit was unripe when they began to gather it. Children from 12 to 16 were requisitioned, and under the supervision of 2 soldiers they knocked down the plums and picked them up. A month later it was the turn of the apples, and then of the pears. The Germans carried off the fruit throughout the country, and we saw hundreds of carts go by, loaded with sacks of apples, which were conveyed to Germany. Among the most troublesome announcements made to the amazed parish, always with a threat against refractory persons, I must recall that which forbade them to cut down grass along roads and paths. This annoyed particularly the owners of rabbits, goats, and kids. The animals were requisitioned, but as long as the Germans were not in need of them, the peasant had to take charge of them, had the use of them, if I may say so. And it was no trifle to feed the cattle, as the provender was requisitioned. In Madame Lantois' big shed the Germans had heaped up a great deal of hay, and towards evening the farmer's wife used to stand on her threshold, and after a glance to the right and left she would run to the shed, gather up an armful of hay, and come back home in a hurry. "My poor beast," she said, "I can't give them enough to eat. When I hear them move about of nights, it nearly breaks my heart. It prevents me from sleeping, it does." In the autumn the potatoes were dug up and sent to the north. The peasants were furious. One of them, busy digging in his own field behind his house, muttered between his teeth, "Isn't it a shame? The very potatoes I have planted myself, and I shan't have any. Wait a minute." He had on a large belt that transformed the upper part of his shirt into a sack. His hand went by turns down to the ground and up to his neck, and he soon had the figure of Punch. While the guard studied the weather, his nose lifted up towards the sky, the man sneaked away, slipped into his house, emptied his belt, came back, and began again. Alas, came the moment when the guard discovered the trick. This guard was a holy man, fat, stout, demure looking, a canting preacher, who not only took the apostleship of his nation for granted, but his own too. When the misappropriated potatoes had got back to the Prussian sacks, our Mr. Smooth-tongue looked at the grieved culprit, grieved at having been caught, looked at the hollow-cheeked faces around him, at the sunken, jaded eyes. He paused before speaking, tossed his head 3 times, and said, "How perverse are the French! Don't you know that stealing is forbidden? And don't you know that the potatoes belong to the Germans? Now then, by taking our potatoes, you commit a theft. It is a disgrace. Be sure you never do such a thing again." Such talk was to be heard from many Germans. It suits them. I delight in hearing them sing this tune, the Gazette des Ardennes at their head, and cry up to the skies the good, the beautiful. They go still further, and my joy increases. They laud the love of their neighbor, respect for the property of others, compassion towards the weak. They extol the meekness, the goodness, the infinite sweet temper of Germany. But oh, it is ever to be regretted that so many noble words should be delivered in vain. Such rubbish does not take with us. "Their Gazette des Ardennes!" exclaimed a farmer's wife. "We buy it only to read the list of French prisoners, and because there is no other newspaper. But when my husband reads it, he never leaves off thumping on the table, and rapping out oaths from beginning to end. Since those filthy fellows have settled themselves down here, one has never a fine word in one's mouth." The other day, another woman told us, my husband had to bring vegetables to Laon. He went to have his pass signed. The sergeant held out his hand to take the paper and said, "Well, comrade?" My husband gave no answer, but he thought to himself, "You, my comrade! I would rather kick you soundly than call you that." Our sense of impotence was never greater than in the month of August, when the Germans trumpeted abroad with a sneer the defeat of the Russians, and, oh sacrilege, ordered our own bells to be rung to celebrate the glorious deeds of the German army. But in September hope rose in our hearts and filled them with joy. The offensive began in Champagne. The cannon raged as never before. How they rolled and shook and roared! And to our minds the uproar was suave, the rumbling was blessed. End of chapter 12, part 2. Chapter 12, Part 3 of 6 Women and the Invasion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. 6 Women and the Invasion by Gabrielle YERTA and Marguerite YERTA. Chapter 12, Part 3. The French airplanes came 8 days running to drop bombs on the station at Laon. 6, 7, even 10 were to be seen at the same time in the sky. They sparkled like jewels in the deep blue heavens. They well nigh drove us mad. We jumped for joy in the garden, cheered them, and would gladly have thrown our hearts out to them. Fortunately, no outsiders were the witnesses of our frenzy, or we should have been found guilty. At Laon, 2 young girls were looking out of an upper window, and at the sight of the dear airplanes had screamed with joy and clapped their hands. Alas, some soldiers saw them from the street and lodged an information against them. They were immediately arrested, tried, and sentenced to a month's imprisonment. We lived in hope for a whole week. The Gazette des Ardennes suppressed the French official reports, which they generally gave at full length, at least so they said, and we thought that the offensive, even in the Germans' opinion, bade fair to succeed. Then the cannon was silent once more, and our hearts sank within us. The fair weather was past. It was cold and rainy, and again, as the year before, we gathered every evening around the lamp, a horrid, evil-smelling horse oil lamp. Our circle was often out of spirits. Our very gestures revealed weariness. 13 months of captivity lay heavy on us, and we had received no news whatever of those we loved. "Oh, they are all dead," sighed Colette. Yet we reposed the strictest confidence in our army. We felt sure victory would ultimately be ours. But oh, how long was victory in coming! It was cold and damp. We were afraid of the coming winter. Though the summer had brought us many hardships, yet we had made shift to live. But how could we manage in the bad season, when we had neither fuel nor vegetables? They had refused us permission to cut down trees in our own woods, though the invaders had massacred them at will. Besides, the Germans chose this very moment to threaten us with enforced service. We were told that we were no longer allowed to get other persons to supply our places as day laborers. The substitutes you find prove that they are still able-bodied, so they must work for their own account and you for yours. "Oh," we moaned, "is there no means of escape from this hell?" We had made several attempts, had addressed petitions and written letters that had been either thrown away or answered with a negative, and now they wanted to add penal servitude to imprisonment. They would oblige us to work from morning till night, in the mud, in the rain. "I prefer going to Chalandry," Genevieve repeated. But we were excused enforced service and exempted from prison. A greater misfortune spared us these troubles. One morning I met in the passage 2 callers who did not ask for jackdaw's legs. One of them, very tall, very thin, and very stiff, with Japanese-like features, bent himself down with a low bow. His companion, smaller, but just as thin and stiff, copied him hastily. "Madame," lisped the former in a faint voice, "I should like to see the owner of this house." I showed both men in, and rushed into my mother-in-law's bedroom. Everybody was in a stir. "What do they want? This visit foretells no good, of course." "It is the General's son," Colette said. "I had him pointed out to me a few days ago." Madame Vallin walked into the dining room, where the visitors were waiting. On tiptoe we went into the passage, and holding our breaths, anxiously listened from behind the door. As soon as my mother-in-law entered the room, the officers got up and bowed themselves at right angles. Then the lisping voice began. "Madame, I am a staff officer. I have been ordered to inform you of a decision that concerns you nearly—" "Ah!" Behind the door left ajar we strained uneasy ears. The speaker went on with his speech. "You are not ignorant, madame, of the painful necessities of the war, and I am sorry to have to tell you that we are in need of your house." "Oh!" It was Genevieve who uttered this stifled cry. Madame Verlaine had no voice to answer. The orator continued: "We are in need of your house for a printing office. It corresponds exactly with our wishes." "But it is my house. I live in it with my family. I have a right to stay in it." "Madame, I am very sorry, but we want it. Today is Thursday. I think we can wait till Monday next to take possession of the house." "But it is impossible. My furniture." "Oh, the house must remain furnished. But you may take away such pieces of furniture as the officers do not want." "But, sir, it is a disgrace!" Genevieve, unable to control her indignation any longer, had pushed the door open, thus unmasking our group, and had entered the lists. Her invasion slightly disturbed the officer. "It is a disgrace! You pretend that you don't make war upon civilians, and you turn 5 women out of doors at the beginning of the winter. You offend against the law of nations. But it is your habit. I know you by your handiwork." Wholly unmoved, the executioner replied: "I see you are excited, and I shall not repeat what I have just heard." "What, indeed! You may repeat it if you like. I should not be afraid to say so to anybody." Always calm and stiff and lisping, the Japanese blonde went back to what he was saying. "You will be quieter by and by. I said we want the house to be free on Monday next. As we may stay in France for months, and even for years, it is our duty to settle things as well as can be. It is our right. I am sorry this is disagreeable for you, but it is war." When he had done talking, he bowed himself to the ground. His companion immediately did the like, and both withdrew. In a deathlike sentence we listened to the retreating steps, to the gate slammed to, and then burst out into lamentations. A fortnight after, we were in Laon. The dear old house, the garden, the furniture were all violated, lost. As nothing else kept us in Morny, we had asked leave to go to Laon, which by way of compensation had been granted to us. So we should not be bound to enforced service, and we could make up for the tediousness of the winter by devouring all the books in the town library. And above all, we should not see plundered and given over to the beasts the beloved old house, embellished by our love, where the family had lived for several generations, where my husband and my sisters-in-law had been born, where they had spent their childhood. We should not see the looking-glasses cracked by awkwardness or malice, the hangings splashed with beer, the carpets torn up, the pieces of furniture burnt one after another for firewood, according to the whims of the servants. We should not see the officers walking 2 by 2 under our lime trees, in our long alleys edged with box, the box beneath which we hid our Easter eggs. The rumor of our expulsion spread abroad, and presently we heard the reason of it. Jacob the linguist, the pompous talker, not to say the chatterbox, told the Lantois, "The ladies' troubles are due to an officer's vengeance. Lieutenant Bubenpeck had a personal grudge against them. He is the nephew of the brigade major, and he thought it amusing to give these ladies a little lesson." Very kind indeed, Herr Bubenpeck. But we know what a pretty thing is German vengeance, and it gets home. And after all, life was more easily bearable in Laon than in the country. Friends of ours who lived near the Porte d'Ardon let us have a little apartment in their house. Our windows overlooked the country, and as usual we could watch the bursting of shells, the captive balloons, and the turning beacons. Horse oil was faithful to our lamps, and we used turf to heat our rooms. I recommend this fuel to those who have a love of dust and smoke. The question of food was hard, but not harder than in Morny. Meat was scarcely to be had. The people dimly remembered the shape of an egg, the color of butter, or oil, or grease, or milk. Babies I know fed on vegetable soup alone from 6 weeks of age. The American Board of Relief distributed provisions similar to those we had enjoyed in Morny: 250 grams of bread a day, a little rice, dry vegetables, from time to time a bit of bacon. Besides, green vegetables were to be had at the greengrocer's. But we were forbidden to buy more than 10 kilograms of potatoes a head per month. At Morny the Germans had generously distributed 20 kilograms a head, but half of them were rotten, and then the population had been told that they had received their winter supply. What we appreciated most in the town was the calmness of the nights. Where superior officers are quartered, subalterns are obliged to save appearances and to conduct their drunken revelries in private. We had no more brutal intrusions to fear. We dreaded no perquisitions, as we had lost everything, and the aspect of so many houses close to one another gave us an impression of security long since forgotten. Yet how sad the town looked! Many houses had been emptied according to the Germans' whims. Furniture, bedding, linen, clothes had been carried away. The officers loaded the women who devoted themselves to soothe the boredom of the war with presents chosen from among this booty. They adorned their apartments with things they had taken from all quarters of the town, and if they did not get from the houses of the absent what they wanted, they applied to those who were still there. Thus it was that a sergeant and 4 men once came to the house of the friends who had received us, to fetch away a set of drawing-room furniture. Protestations were of no avail. "I have my orders. Make out an invoice, take it to the Kommandantur, and a note of hand will be delivered to you." To any complaint which the wronged owner might make, an officer answered: "I have but one word of advice to give you. Keep quiet and hold your tongue." The streets always swarmed with officers and soldiers on foot and on horseback. All shops were open by order of the Germans, but there was nothing to be sold in most of them. No articles of food were to be had, and the stock of shoes, materials, and clothes was nearly exhausted by the needs of the people and by frequent requisitions. In November all silk goods had been requisitioned, even ribbons above 10 centimeters breadth. Many empty shops, which had been plundered after the departure of the owners, had been laid hold of by German civilians, who had lost no time in bringing their little trade to France. Thus you might admire a stationer's and 2 booksellers' shops, a jeweler's, various kinds of paltry stuff, a boot and shoe warehouse, a hairdressing salon, and so on. These patriotic establishments were always thronged with customers, in uniform of course. The Kommandantur sold officially in a shop thus installed Belgian lace of great beauty, marvels of point, Brussels, Bruges, Mechlin. After a month it was offered for sale in the town hall alone, and so the sight of these treasures was kept back from French eyes. The officers scrambled for this lace, which, in spite of high prices, sold wonderfully well. For the rest, military men of all ranks spent a great deal of money, and a French jeweler told us that private soldiers often spent upon gold chains and rings all the money they possessed. Was it a way to convert their paper money into something safer? Later on they were forbidden to pay for their purchases in silver or in German notes, and the tradesmen were not allowed to receive anything from the soldiers but municipal bank notes, and were bound to give back only German or French money. These rules were a great hindrance to business. In the autumn of 1915 the magnanimous, high-souled military authorities decreed that the persons who had concealed wine, well-hidden wine alone had escaped being requisitioned, would avoid close searches and severe punishments by making a statement of the quantity they possessed. Afraid and tired out, many people complied, and handed over what they had so long kept out of sight, and thousands of bottles went down the throats of our tormentors. More serious was the proclamation which granted a delay to the French soldiers still in the invaded territory. The blockade had taken a great many of them by surprise, and had prevented them from reaching the French line. They wore civil clothes and lived under an assumed name. Some of them had surrendered at the beginning of the invasion. Others had been discovered and shot. But the new regulation enabled those who were hidden to give themselves up until the 20th of November. From that date every French soldier caught in invaded territory would be looked upon as a spy and be immediately shot. As many as 80 surrendered before the stated day. And oh, desolation! The very day after they arrested, in a suburb of the town where he lived disguised as a workman, a French officer, a captain. We read on the bills stuck up in the streets that he had been shot in the citadel. Another announcement threatened the villagers more than the townspeople. It intimated that every criminal attempt made at any point of the railroads would immediately bring terrible reprisals upon the inhabitants of the neighboring villages. Whether guilty or not, the unhappy wretches would be driven from their houses if the military authorities thought proper. The women would be taken away and the men enrolled in the gangs of laborers. Besides, such hostages as the Germans selected might be shot. On the other hand, the invaders were always in readiness to drain the country of the little money that was left. Many means were at their disposal. Fines were showered down upon the towns and villages. If a French airplane dropped bombs on the Laon station, the town was quickly condemned to pay upwards of 100,000 francs. In October, to mark, no doubt, the anniversary of the German occupation, the invaded were warned that they would have to pay a second contribution of war. The chief authorities of the communes were told that those under their charge would soon get into the habit of paying tribute, very likely every quarter, to the conquerors. And when all the money has thus been wrung from all purses, well, you will but have to issue municipal notes, which you will give to us, the Prussians. So when the war is at an end, when you have all been eaten out of house and home, you will all the same be our debtors. They were just as ingenious in fooling the farmers. In that year, 1915, the peasants had tilled the fields themselves. But the Germans are scrupulously honest, as everyone knows. "We are going," they said, "to pay you for your trouble and your corn. You will receive 20 francs a hectare." Splendid amende, rich indemnity. Morny was entitled to 18,000 francs. "Yes," the Germans went on, "but you remember that old fine of yours, which you never paid entirely. Besides, there is the quarter's contribution to the war, and 1,000 francs fine imposed for a passport that was not viséd. In short, when it is all added up, you owe to us 800 francs." The civilians who had to listen to these speeches hung their heads. The account was right. They could not plead false arithmetic. 2 and 2 always make 4, especially when the German army maintains it. This gave heart to the Prussians to go still further. "Let us talk of the future. Next year we shall cultivate the fields ourselves. Of course it is but right that you should remunerate us for so doing. Our tillage is worth 56 francs a hectare. Besides, you must pay us our expenses. 3 hectolitres of seed a hectare, at the highest possible price. We will be paid beforehand." The sums total was 92,000 francs for the village of Morny alone, and there were about 1,500 inhabitants left in Morny, all in utter poverty after the exactions of which they had been victims. Fortunately, the Prussians put the remedy at the sufferers' disposal. If you have no money left, you possess good pieces of land which you might pledge. We have just founded a German-Belgian bank in Brussels which will lend you some money. These honest offers were made in the month of December, but we do not know how things befell, for the dawn rose again for us. Convoys were organized for a second time. We blessed the number of the Gazette des Ardennes, which at the end of November brought us the good news. 20,000 persons were to be chosen in the invaded territory, first among the poor and the sick, and the people whose usual residence was on the other side of the front. We feared lest our demand should be rejected, and we left no stone unturned to prevent refusal. At length we were told that our names had been put down on the list of the emigrants. It was the end of the year. Colette still hoped to see the French come back before our departure. But alas, nothing of the kind happened. Christmas, New Year's Day were kept as they had been kept a year before, sadly by the French, merrily by the Germans. Then the month of January, cold and foggy, glided by, and we were still kept waiting. At length the day of the departure came. The convoy, the mass of emigrants, were strikingly like the herd we had witnessed the year before. Yet I think we saw more sick people. There were many who coughed. When once we were all seated in a carriage, we five, with two little orphan girls, who went to meet their grandmother at Lyons, the train moved off at last, and such an emotion seized upon us that no one uttered a word. The first time our flight had been stopped at Chevrigny, a second time at Jouvy. How far should we go now? We had been told that there would be no quarantine. Was it true? We were traveling through a gray country. The night fell and the dawn rose again. We were in Germany. We made many a long stop in the stations. Soldiers distributed coffee and soup in the carriages. We had taken with us, put by from our pittance of a whole week, dry toast, barley coffee, and licorice wood tea. As to tasting the soup, no thank you. We peered through the windows, but did not see anything worth looking at. Towns and villages were gloomy. In the stations, boys of about 13 did the work of railway porters. The night fell again. We reached the Black Forest, which was white with snow. We wound our way up a mountain and caught sight of a vale far below us. The branches of the fir trees bent beneath their pure burden, and the cloak spread over the ground was so dazzling that it gave light to the starless night. Houses were to be seen everywhere, grouped together in hamlets and villages, or standing apart in the mountain, good-natured looking houses nestled in the snow, with gaily lit-up windows. Then I cast my eyes about me. My companions were slumbering, and the flickering light brought out the paleness of their uneasy faces. One of the little girls was coughing, and we could hear other people who seemed to echo back the same sad sound. The long train that rolled along was full of wretchedness and misery, and from those snug little houses, from those towns we had just crossed, came the soldiers who had rushed upon our country. From thence the plunderers, the drunkards, the debauchees, the executioners. From thence came those who have carried dismay into a peaceful country, who have converted a happy industrious population into a fearful enslaved herd. May you be cursed, cursed! And there, in the big houses, in the towns, live still the accomplices. They are all there. The lamp is bright, the stove lit up. Dinner is over. They are smoking their pipes and reading their papers. And in the invaded territory, thousands and thousands of people have gone to bed at 6 because they have no light, no fire, and no dinner. And the others are there. They read the papers. They praise whatever the German army does. They admire the German soldiers. They approve all high-handed measures. And those who are at home, as well as those away from home, lift up their eyes towards the sky, and thank God for not being like the rest of mankind. Ah, no, you are not like the rest of mankind. Could we shout it loud enough? Is there any cry that might pierce your dull conscience? Are there maledictions of sufficient vehemence to penetrate the carapace in which you have wrapped up your understanding? Ah, I wish I were 100-tongued, and gifted with more than human genius, the better to proclaim your infamy, the better to cry out upon the sufferings with which you do not cease to load us. I can but repeat what I have seen, what I have heard, what I have borne. I shall never be weary of lifting up a corner of the veil in which you wrap yourselves, you dissemblers, you false-faced, false-hearted men. On your features of brutality and violence you wear a benignant, canting mask. You assume a candid, astonished look, and turn round to the neutrals, to Europe, to all civilized powers, saying, "We are charged with evil deeds. Look if it is like us." You resemble the woman of whom the Bible says, "She wipes her mouth and says, 'I have done no harm.'" You reject with a shrug of your shoulders those of your actions which might make you uneasy. Your accommodating consciences do away with them, and they immediately fall into oblivion. But we are sure to remember what you forget. You have shown yourselves openly, and we know your real faces only too well, their unrelenting harshness, their falseness, their incomprehension. And in your double face we spit out the horror and scorn you rouse in us. And yet we admire you. Your presence was attended with murder, fire, acts of violence and plunder. You have displayed a powerful, splendid, hideous bestiality, and it is that bestiality which we admire in you. Do not reject the title of barbarians. It is the only one that suits you. You might have been fine barbarians, but for a long time to come you will be only shabby civilized men. I had rather see you stand on a pedestal and hear you shout, exaggerating your misdeeds, overstraining your cruelty, your vices, your animality. Yes, we are barbarians, and then? Thus you might have been great, and since you are strong, since you know how to fight, you would have been like a hero who defends himself as he is, and not like a little girl about to be whipped who tries to deny her fault and weeps. Believe me, you will cut no figure in history as saints. Where your horses have trodden, the grass will not spring up again for long. So make up your minds, unmask yourselves, and cry out, "We are the barbarians!" The train had reached the highest point of its journey. All the vale and the slopes of the mountains were flecked with 1,000 brilliant points. They were the windows of the houses, more smiling than ever. A few moments passed, and then a kind of excitement came over us. Were we approaching the Swiss frontier? We had still to wait in our carriages for the morning. Long hours together we should have to wait for our turn to be searched, and allow the nurses to examine the soles of our shoes and the hems of our garments. But what did it matter? We were in raptures. It was over. Our martyrdom was at an end. We were in Switzerland. We were free. A fraternal welcome cheered us all along the road. Here was rich Zurich, whose prosperity dazzled our eyes. Then came Bern and fair Geneva at the end of its blue lake. Here was at last— oh, my heart, do not throb so violently! Here she was, France, it was France, unsullied France, where no Germans breathe, living, active France, the France that will crush the enemy. We saw Mont Blanc watch over the frontier. Then we came within sight of the valley, of a rocky land, and then of the plain as vast as the hope which filled our hearts. And now that we had reached France, now that we rode in a French carriage, we sat close to one another, and with tears in our eyes looked at the landscape. We felt heavy with an overwhelming joy, and we waited for the morrow, not knowing whether it would bring happiness or mourning. End of Chapter 12, Part 3. End of 6 Women and the Invasion by Gabrielle YERTA and Marguerite YERTA. Recorded by Rita Boutros.